I wanted to respond to a comment I got on one of my videos about Ephesians 1 and sort of explain something that I wish I would have explained better in some of these videos about Ephesians 1, and something that in the future when I do discuss this passage, I think it's very important to kind of point this out, what I'm going to talk about today. So to start out, I'm just going to read this comment. So this is a comment from a guy who I'm assuming is coming from a more Reformed Calvinistic perspective. So I'm going to assume, and correct me if I'm wrong, to the one who commented this, if you're not a Calvinist, I'm just kind of getting that from what you're saying. So he says this: we were predestined for adoption. And then he quotes Ephesians 1:5. He predestined us for adoption to himself as sons through Jesus Christ according to the purpose of his will. And he says, how do you get around this plain and simple truth? So this adoption, being predestined to adoption, we got to figure out what is Paul talking about here? Okay, the assumption of what seems to be the assumption of this person, what is the assumption of Calvinism, is that to be predestined for adoption looks like, before you were saved, before you were connected to Christ by faith, God looked at you and predetermined that you would eventually become adopted, i.e., saved. So I think the Calvinists would look at this word adoption as sons and look at it as like an initial salvation idea. Like it's that point where you go out of being lost into being found, out of being dead in sin to being alive in Christ. It's the point of going from unbelief to faith, regeneration. So adoption as sons, again, I think to the Calvinists, they look at this and they see, oh, God predestined that we would eventually get saved. We'd eventually be placed in Christ. So going back to Ephesians 1, I think something that is so important and so often, I would even argue, ignore on the side of Calvinism when interpreting these passages is what, when you look at the word chose, when it says God chose us in him, when it says God predestined us, what is it in Ephesians 1 that Paul is saying we are chosen and predestined for? So let's just look at these verses and answer that question of what is it that God is choosing believers for. Verse 4, even as he chose us in him before the foundation of the world, for what? That we would eventually get saved? Did God choose us before the foundation of the world that we would eventually come to be in Christ? Did God choose before the foundation of the world that we would eventually in our lifetime believe in him and be saved? No, God chose us in him. God chose Christians before the foundation of the world. God chose that believers would be holy and blameless before him. I would argue that this is talking about an end point, like a final destination. It's as if Paul is saying one of the benefits of being on the boat of Jesus, of being on the ark that is Christ, is that the ultimate destination of this ship is holy and blameless before God. At the judgment seat, you will be counted holy and blameless before him, above reproach. That is one of the benefits, one of the spiritual blessings that God placed in Christ. In other words, this is saying God chose, before the foundation of the world, he chose that those in Christ, their ultimate destination would be holy and blameless. This isn't saying anything about God choosing who would be in Christ. It's simply telling us what God chose as the destination for those who are in him. And I don't know if you see the distinction there, if you see the significance of that difference, but I think it is very significant. Even though it might seem trivial, that difference, I think it's huge. I think Paul continues with that same sort of future benefit idea when he goes on in verse 5 to say, in love, he predestined us for adoption as sons through Jesus Christ according to the purpose of his will. So again, the question here, what we have to be careful about is that when we see that word predestined us, that we don't immediately assume initial salvation, that we don't immediately assume some mysterious choice of God, some selection, divine selection of God of who would get in and who would not get in. So he predestined us for adoption as sons through Jesus Christ. Is there anywhere else in the New Testament that we could look to where Paul talks about adoption that might give us a little bit more clarity about what he's intending to say here? So Romans 8, verse 23 says, not only the creation, but we ourselves who have the first fruit of the Spirit, So these are Christians. He's saying we ourselves, those who are already in Christ, if you will, those of us who have already been brought from death to life, those of us who are already saved, groan inwardly as we wait eagerly for adoption as sons. So wait a minute. The Calvinist sees Ephesians 1:5. They see predestined for adoption, and they assume that's God choosing who will get in. That's God. That's proof that God, as this person in the comment says, this is plain and simple truth that God predestined who would get in, who would be saved, who would initially have that initial moment of salvation, of coming from death to life. Well, Paul is saying that this is actually something that even those of us who are already saved, those of us who are already in the family of God, are waiting for. This adoption as sons is something that Paul, even for believers, is extending to some future date. And so I would say, again, he's continuing with the same train of thought where he says he chose us in him to be holy and blameless. So Paul here is talking about this ultimate destination for believers. And again, Romans 8, it says, we wait eagerly for adoption as sons, the redemption of our bodies. So adoption as sons is equivalent, I think, in Paul's mind, this analogy that he uses a few times. Adoption is that moment in time where believers get resurrected, glorified bodies. A future event that has not yet taken place. So when Calvinists look at this, they see the word chose, they see the word predestined, and they assume, oh, God chose who would get saved initially. God chose who would get in the house, in other words. God chose who would get in Christ, and this proves it. Plain and simple truth, like this person says. Well, I think if we look a little bit closer, we see that this isn't saying that at all. This is Paul's not having a discussion here about how God chose who would get in and who would not. He's talking about what God determined, what God chose would be the ultimate benefits for those who are already in this house. And so if we look at this in sort of an analogous way, this is, if we say this represents Christ, if we want to use the analogy again of the ark, in Christ, this is the sphere in which God has chosen, as it says in Ephesians 1:3, he placed every spiritual blessing in the heavenly places in Christ. So rather than, as the Calvinist says, is the plain and simple truth of this text, the way they understand it, they look at it and say, look, God, all throughout history has selected which individuals will get to be inside of this sphere, which is Christ. He chose and predestined, you get to be in, you get to be in, you get to be in, and the rest don't. That's not the idea here. The idea is rather not God selecting who would get to be in initially. It's that God selected, determined before the foundations of the world what the benefits, what the spiritual blessings would be for those who came to be in this sphere. He placed the blessings in this sphere and said, wherever this sphere goes, you will go. So in other words, if we use a piece of paper here, this is us, and we say this is Christ. To be in Christ is to have this connection, this union with him, so that when you're in him, your destiny, your identity becomes bound with his. You don't have an identity in and of yourself that consists of being a son of God, chosen, elect. All these things are part of the identity that we get as a result, as a benefit of existing within this sphere. If you're in Christ, one of the benefits you get is that your ultimate destination is that you will be adopted as a son, getting a glorified body, and you will be counted holy and blameless before God in love. This isn't telling you God selected that you would get in. It's telling you he selected, determined what would happen for those who are in.